Zeus can be described as an enigmatic, uncompromising, and to many a very controversial deity. But whether you like him or hate him, there's no denying that he's the driving force behind many of the stories to emerge from Greek mythology. It's understandable to dislike someone who causes so many conflicts and issues, but without these conflicts we have no stories, or at least none that aren't linear and boring. Today's video will cover a story that we don't know much about other than a few speculative accounts. The story of what happened when the Olympians attempted to rebel against Zeus and take his throne. Before we discuss the event itself, we first need to understand how the power structure and hierarchy worked in Greek mythology. There's no doubt that the majority of deities were extremely powerful, but we don't really know how powerful when compared to one another, because that wasn't really something that was measured back then, at least not to the extent that it is today, where we need to know who is the strongest and who would defeat who in any given scenario. To establish a rulership and become king of the gods, it boiled down to who was brave enough and confident enough to step forward and take the throne, which doesn't necessarily mean the king or the ruler was the most powerful. We first see this when Uranus is dethroned by his children, and Cronus assumes the mantle of king. This began the cycle and the prophecy that stated the ruler would be dethroned by his children. Despite his best efforts, Cronus would eventually suffer defeat to Zeus and his siblings, meaning the established power dynamic was shattered and a new ruler would have to step forward. You can definitely argue or debate as to which of Zeus, Poseidon, or Hades was the most powerful deity and which one of them should have been the ruler. But it was Zeus who freed his siblings and ultimately defeated his father, and it was Zeus once again through his own trickery who ensured that he would rule the skies and claim the throne atop Mount Olympus. There were several attempts to overthrow Zeus, long before the Olympians tried to do so themselves, with the majority of these coming from Gaia, the primordial goddess of the earth and the mother of the Titans. Firstly, when along with Tartarus she created Typhon, with the sole intention of destroying the Olympians, and this was Zeus's first real test as a leader. There are numerous accounts of this story, but in most of them the gods chose to flee to Egypt when faced with the daunting presence that was Typhon. Zeus however chose to stay, and after a grueling battle, where victory seemed almost impossible, Zeus was finally able to overcome Typhon and crush the first rebellion against his rule. Similar to the first rebellion, the second came from the giants who were being encouraged by Gaia, seeking revenge for her children. Their attack on Olympus was fairly easily repelled by the Olympians, who also had help from Heracles. Needless to say, this rebellion was nowhere near the level of the previous, and it wouldn't be until the coup of the Olympians that the rule of Zeus would be threatened once again. So as we now move on to the Olympian coup, we should take a look at Zeus as a leader. It's fairly difficult to describe Zeus as a tyrannical leader, because the gods and goddesses were free to do as they please for the most part, and Zeus certainly didn't care about maintaining total control of everything, as important areas such as law and justice were governed by other deities, though Zeus's word would still be final. This type of loose leadership could be seen as a way of avoiding the prophecy that stated he would be overthrown by his children. If you give your children and fellow gods the freedom to do as they please, then it's less likely they have a reason to rebel, and this most likely would have worked, but Zeus didn't anticipate the driving factor behind the rebellion, his wife Hera. So what exactly would cause Hera to rebel against Zeus? Hera was largely regarded as the queen of Olympus and the wife of Zeus. You could argue that she was the second in power. Being married to Zeus, however, was definitely no easy task, as he took several other wives, and we know his sexual appetite led to him having many affairs. The way Hera would deal with Zeus's many infidelities mostly consisted of lashing out and punishing his many wives and many children, but eventually she must have reached the point where the only solution was to remove Zeus, and thus the coup began. In order to overthrow Zeus, Hera would need assistance, and that came in the form of Apollo, Poseidon, and Athena, who themselves desired the throne. Homer does briefly mention that he thought Poseidon was capable of overthrowing Zeus by himself, but he chose not to, because he did not care for the throne, so it's clear that he believes that Poseidon is more powerful than Zeus. In some versions of this story, Hera would drug Zeus to induce a deep sleep, and in other versions the sleep was much more natural. The other gods then chained him to where he slept and began arguing as to who would take his place, each one believing that they were best suited to rule. The only deity not to take part was Hestia, who did not care for things such as power. The mother of Achilles, Thetis, had made it previously known that Zeus was the rightful leader of Olympus, and if anyone else was to take the throne, then chaos would ensue. Whilst the bickering between the Olympians continued, Thetis did the only thing she could, and sent a message to Briareus, the biggest and strongest of the Hecatonchires, asking for his assistance. The Hecatonchires had long remained friends and allies of Zeus, for it was Zeus who freed them from Tartarus and allowed them to obtain their revenge upon their Titan brothers and sisters. The calls from Thetis would not go unanswered, as Briareus climbed Olympus and destroyed the chains that bound Zeus. Now at full strength and with the most powerful Hecatonchire by his side, the other gods and goddesses had no option but to kneel before Zeus and accept their coup was a failure. Athena, being Zeus's favourite, managed to escape punishment, but the others did not share this fortune. Apollo and Poseidon were sentenced to hard labour, where they were forced to help build the walls of Troy. The punishment of Hera involved her being thrown into the void and suspended in the sky with anvils hanging from her ankles, where she would remain staring into chaos until she took a vow swearing allegiance to Zeus once again. Needless to say, after this failed coup, Zeus's leadership would never be questioned again. Over the years there were several attempts to overthrow Zeus. Some of these came from outside Olympus, and the event we've just discussed came from those that Zeus trusted the most. But all of them were unsuccessful, and it appears that Zeus was able to break the cycle of surrendering power and being overthrown by your children. Personally, I think that Zeus was the rightful leader of Olympus, and I know many people may disagree with me, but without Zeus and his many shenanigans, Greek mythology would be a far less interesting place. If you would have preferred someone else to take the throne, then let me know who, along with your reasons why in the comments below. As always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained.